Yes. So I would like to invite Pamela Collins, who is a professor of psychology and global health at the University of Washington. She's come all the way to be with us today, and she is our keynote speaker. Thank you, Pamela.
Thank you so much. Well, I am really delighted to be here, and I want to thank you, Atalanti and Gaia, and Giving Women for inviting me to be here. It's been amazing to meet so many fascinating people, and I wish we had 2 more days to have a chance to have real conversations at length, but thank you. Almost 15 years ago, while I was living in New York City, I took a 3-week journey to Spain. And this was to walk 200 miles or 300 kilometers of the Camino of Santiago de Compostela, the ancient pilgrimage route that crosses the country. I did this to think, to pray, to listen. And one morning, the path took me through beautiful woods. Not too dense, but in every direction, all I could see were trees. The sunlight shone through the late spring green leaves, casting a really magical glow. And it was quiet, and I was alone in the woods, in a country not my own. And it dawned on me that I was indeed alone. And I couldn't see anyone ahead of me or behind me. And I paused to just enjoy that feeling. And what dawned on me next was that I was not afraid. Women in the woods alone are often afraid. And I realized that that was a gift, because as a woman, I have been socialized to think about safety, to be aware of security, and for good reason. Women and girls are often unsafe, and not solely because of physical threats, but often because of social norms that discriminate, because of bias that threatens their life chances. And these social environmental factors deeply influence our mental health. And this is true across our lives. 105 boys are born for every 100 girls. This is the natural sex ratio around the world. Births are male biased in every country, and girls, however, typically outsurvive boys because of biological vulnerabilities that boys around the world experience. So over the lifetime, these numbers even out. And right now, women around the world make up just under half of the global population, 49.6%. But in some countries, the sex ratio at birth is more skewed than would occur naturally. That means there are more boys than one might expect. This is particularly common across some parts of Asia and North Africa, where sons are preferred, and where there is clear evidence of the selection of boys through prenatal sex determination and selective abortion. And where there is a clear son preference, the sex ratio at birth becomes increasingly skewed with birth order. So by the 3rd or 4th born, children are most likely to be boys. As a result, there are more than 140 million missing women in the world, according to the State of the World Population Report. So environment is important, and social cultural environments can determine whether girls survive infancy. Girls move into adolescence, shaped by the ideas and norms that the people in their environments hold about them. They're shaped by the environments and ideas about their worth, about their potential, and gender norms influence their life chances. Some forms of gender-based discrimination are accentuated during adolescence, like violence, some of the things you just mentioned, Adelanti, child, early and forced marriage, sexual abuse and exploitation, limitations on reproductive control, exclusion from education, from employment or decision-making, and unequal burdens of chores and caregiving responsibilities. So what does this look like? Girls are more likely than boys to be married as children, to drop out of school, and to experience forced sexual initiation. Nearly 30% of adolescent girls between the ages of 15 and 19 report lifetime physical and/or sexual violence by an intimate partner. And of course, there are implications for mental health. Adolescence, as we all know, is a dynamic time of neurodevelopmental change for girls and boys. And the incidence of depression, anxiety, and suicidality increases for girls during this period due to hormonal changes as well as environmental threats. Girls are more likely than boys to attempt suicide. And at puberty, girls' increased risk of depression begins, and this twofold greater prevalence of depression for women versus men persists throughout our lives into older age. And interestingly, early maturation at puberty is associated with lasting and more severe depression in girls. And at the same time, exposure to social adversity, whether that's poor parental relationship quality, whether that's childhood sexual abuse, predicts early maturation in girls, suggesting that for girls, the transition to puberty is even more responsive to the environment and environmental adversity than it is for boys. So these critical exposures continue as girls and young women enter childbearing years. So mental health in the perinatal period, that's the mental health during pregnancy and the first year after delivery, is another period that's critical for women and their children. About 10 to 15% of women experience perinatal depression, and the prevalence can be as high as 19 to 25% for women in less resourced settings. Maternal mental health in the perinatal period forms part of the early life experience of the baby, of the child. And perinatal depression has been linked to low birth weight, to premature delivery for newborns, but also to depression and anxiety, to conduct disorder, to learning difficulties in children. So mother's mental health is very important for the child. And we should say parental mental health is important for children. What's less talked about in perinatal depression is often that the risk of suicide is elevated during this time as well. Maternal suicides account for 20% of postnatal deaths and are one of the leading causes of mortality in the postpartum period. And a major risk factor for perinatal depression is another environmental influence, and that's intimate partner violence. So lack of safety takes many forms. Sometimes women are thrust into catastrophic situations that require every emotional and physical resource for survival. On February 23rd of this year, I received an email from a close colleague in Ukraine. She's part of ITEC, which is the multi-country team that I lead that works with ministries of health and healthcare providers to increase access to HIV prevention, care, and treatment, and to mental health care in some of the countries where we work. She wrote to tell us how things were going on that peaceful morning before the bombing began less than 24 hours later. Many of my colleagues joined the millions of Ukrainians who were internally displaced or who crossed borders for safety. According to the United Nations High Commission on Refugees, more than 100 million people around the world are forcibly displaced due to war or due to other crises. Ukraine, Venezuela, Burkina Faso, Myanmar, Ethiopia, we could go on. Each have populations facing these threats. And displacement has gender-specific effects. Displaced women often have less access to employment opportunities, to services, including mental health care, sexual and reproductive health services, continued education and skills training, and resources for survivors of gender-based violence. Forcibly displaced women in countries that have often been studied consistently experience more violence in the home, and in some countries, more sexual violence by other perpetrators. Women, of course, are vulnerable to violent acts during war. Rape and sexual violence are often used as a strategy of warfare. But even outside of wartime and outside of displacement contexts, violence against women is an abuse of human rights. It's a violation of women's rights to freedom from torture and their right to the highest attainable health and well-being. So not surprisingly, exposure to domestic violence is associated with elevated rates of mental disorders as well. By some accounts, a threefold greater likelihood of depression, a fourfold increase in anxiety disorders, a sevenfold increase in post-traumatic stress disorder. And evidence suggests that there is a bidirectional relationship between gender-based violence and mental disorders, where domestic violence and abuse increase the likelihood of depression. And this is true among women who've never experienced depressive symptoms. But there's also an association between having depression and subsequent domestic violence and abuse. So in this case, treating depression becomes a tool for increasing wellness and safety. Lack of safety also takes more subtle and pervasive forms, particularly when women and girls have multiple identities that are devalued. When race or ethnicity or caste or sexual orientation make seeking mental health care risky because discrimination and bias are present in the healthcare system, or in the labor market, or in the educational system, where is the safe place? Some years ago, while designing HIV prevention interventions for women with serious mental illnesses in New York, I had the privilege of recording narratives of women's lives who were often women of color and immigrants and who were living with a chronic and persistent mental health condition. For immigrants, how do you navigate launching the career in a new country when depression is a barrier, language is a barrier, and the hectic, disconnected way of life in this new place is foreign to you? Where do you land when you're, quote, in the state of symptoms and you can't get out, as a young woman with schizophrenia who'd immigrated to New York once put it to me? How do you save your relationship, navigate the discrimination associated with the symptoms, avoid being dismissed by your family because your manic symptoms are recurring? We all need reliable places of refuge, and I think the COVID epidemic has taught us that more than anything recently. But we need these places of safety where environmental stressors can be diminished. At the interpersonal level, the women that I met created this by redefining what people around them called crazy. They described mental illness as the treatable condition for which they received care in a trustworthy community clinic whose environment they helped to influence. As researchers, we help to build these places of safety by building the evidence for mental health interventions in the diversity of countries and cultural contexts where people live and navigate their lives. And we do that collaboratively with the people who will use these interventions, those who will deliver them, and those who will sustain them. As implementers of programs, we can do this by implementing what works and by establishing inclusive processes for learning from mistakes and iteratively improving quality. And by being purposeful about confronting stigma and discrimination where they occur, even in the healthcare system, even in community structures. As citizens of cities and communities, we do this by purposefully setting out to build communities of belongingness and relatedness. That requires advocacy for the protection of rights for some members of our communities, for the availability of services for others. And it requires a commitment to building connectedness, something that Giving Women clearly values. And decision makers, finally, can take 5 actions. First, recognize and respond to racism and discrimination in all of its forms as a threat to health and well-being. We do this now as part of a global community that recognizes the danger to dignity, health, and well-being that stems from inequalities based on race, ethnicity, gender, ability, or any other human characteristic. Number 2, stimulate and accelerate the efforts to achieve the 17 Sustainable Development Goals. These include the interventions to reduce gender-based violence, child maltreatment, racial discrimination, and xenophobia, cash transfers or basic income grants, improved employment, safe neighborhoods, reduction in violence, early response to environmental threats, access to quality education, and supportive social networks. All of these can improve mental health outcomes. Reaching these targets by 2030 will require greater investment as well as greater political will. At a time when, due to COVID-19, global direct foreign investments have plummeted in many cases. But we're in Geneva. This is the place to have this conversation. Invest in social interventions, using community empowerment as an approach to mental health promotion. seeking the mental health benefits of a community-led advocacy and intervention participation, placing people at the center of service design, delivery, and scope, and deepening our understanding of how intervening on social determinants affects population mental health. All of these can move us closer to meeting this challenge. Number 4, ensure access to quality and affordable mental health care and primary care. In tandem with greater attention to social determinants of health, the redesign of health systems to integrate mental health care with other chronic disease care, and the establishment of parity between mental and other medical conditions remains a grand challenge for the global community. And number 5, reduce disparities in mental health care. This requires understanding how intersectionality influences health disparities that emerge from race and ethnicity, gender and transgender identity, living with a severe mental health condition, for example, poverty and inequality, and other disadvantaged statuses. Working to reduce these disparities requires understanding which groups receive less care and why, and tailoring efforts to engage people in care, ensuring affordability and employing care delivery models that facilitate access and continuity. And right now, we're at a time in the global mental health community where those innovations are coming from all over. They're not just coming from high-income countries, they're coming from everywhere. And this is the opportunity that we have, is to learn from these innovations and these creative interventions around the world. So let me just close by reminding us that we have a shared global vision, one that seeks to, and I quote, realize the human rights of all and to achieve gender equality and empowerment of all women and girls as a fundamental aspect of achieving transformative, sustainable economic, social, and environmental development. All of our countries have committed to working tirelessly to 2030, that's only 7 years from now, to end poverty and hunger everywhere, to combat inequalities within and among countries, to build peaceful and just inclusive societies, to protect human rights and promote gender equality and the empowerment of women and girls, and to ensure the lasting protection of the planet and its natural resources. This is women's mental health. Thank you.